how do you just come back to the present and feel the safety that's here? And that's actually where the best future emerges from often. It's usually the pain that starts to motivate a lot of men. And I don't think that pattern continues, but often people sort of have to hit rock bottom or their version of rock bottom before they start to change. When things are working and we feel good, there's not a lot of impetus to shift. But over time, we get more sensitive of when things are out of integrity or out of alignment.
Welcome everyone to the Mind Triumph podcast, the mental health podcast, the topic that's so important to each and every one of us. At this podcast, we cover that mental health topic from multiple angles, but one that we're really particularly interested in is that inner critic, the inner talker that we call the talker in you. Now, every guest brings something really exceptional when it comes to insights and things we can take away. But today's guest, Michael, who is a counselor amongst other things, that he's going to fill in the gaps for us because he's such an amazing, rich individual. I mean, just getting to know a little bit about him from being a monk, and please correct me if I'm wrong on any of these, Michael, when you have a chance here, but from eco-psychology, masters in eco-psychology, or with kind of emphasis on eco-psychology, to working with men on different kinds of trauma. We're going to learn a lot from Michael. So I'm excited. This episode is going to be nothing short of absolutely spectacular. So Michael, thank you for being a guest on our show. I'm really looking forward to this conversation about mental health and some of the topics we're going to cover with you. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Thanks so much, Alex. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Oh, absolutely. And now we're going to go deeper in the topic of mental health. But before we start, can you tell us a bit about yourself? And let's see where the conversation takes us from there.
Yeah, sure. I'll give a little background on how I got here. So I spent a lot of my 20s traveling, and I became a wilderness guide and just had a deep passion and love and sense of connection in nature. So I spent a lot of time there, as well as a lot of deep meditation practice in a Buddhist tradition. Following that thread of feeling a lot of grief around sort of the destruction of a lot of what's going on in the ecosphere, I started pulling at the threads and wondering how I could make some impact and change, and kind of came to how, humans are the species who's affecting the ecosystem the most by far. We're in the Anthropocene age where the humans are making more impact to the planet than anything else. And realizing that a lot of the human action comes out of our mindset. So, before we can take some action, wholesome or unwholesome, there's a thought that comes first that, that it comes from the mind, and then we take action. So realizing that a place to impact change of how we as a species are impacting the ecosphere is to actually first change our mind, change our worldview, change our mindset, and how we're in relationship with the world. And then, we change our actions so that we act very differently and have different impacts.
Like what Michael is saying, and what I'm understanding is how he got to focus on the mind, because mind precedes actions. Often we will focus on the external and trying to do things. But I think what Michael is trying to say here is that, well, wait a minute, everything starts with thought first. And even in the Bible, they say everything starts with thought, for those people who follow the Bible, of course. But please continue, Michael, please.
Yeah, thanks for that summary reflection. So coming from that place, I became a counselor so I could work with people and their minds. And developing in there, I developed more and more interest in passion in working with men, partially because I am a man. I have lived experience as being socialized in our culture as men, and then became, very interested in what is this male worldview. And this also intersects a lot with the environmental things, where, some people call it patriarchy, but there's this sort of water we're swimming in of worldviews and beliefs of, how men are meant to function and women are meant to function. And I see a lot of room for shift around how we act as men and our influence in culture and, how civilization acts. There's men are half the people here. So, there's huge impact. So, and a lot of that can be negative. There's a lot of rhetoric around toxic masculinity, and, there is some very bad behavior that a lot of men have. So get really curious about sort of unwinding that so that men's influence can be more beautiful.
Beautiful.
So that's where my work has landed right now. It's working.
This is beautiful. And thank you for for kind of stressing the fact that you're working with particularly with men, because from my experience with this in this world, men often are neglected when it comes to mental health, or at least historically it's been that way. I think it's changing, like you pointed out, but often, like I know growing up, uh, we didn't talk about feelings or emotions or trauma. I wasn't allowed to cry necessarily, or it would be looked at as a sign of weakness. And I think this is translated into today's world where people search for help from mental health specialists or experts like yourself. But it's mostly seems to be, or the majority is from the female side. Am I correct to assume this? Or
Yeah, totally. And this is part of the context we swim in of, our patriarchal culture. Some people don't like this word so much, but I think it's a useful frame. And I like to make the distinction between sort of political patriarchy, what's going on the, more political level, but what's going on psychological. So the psychological patriarchy has this, and this is from Terry Real. He's an amazing couples therapist. But the map is that, we have things that are coded masculine, confidence, leadership, directness, assertiveness, things that are celebrated in men in our culture. And then there's things that are coded more feminine. So emotionality, connection, relationship, sensuality, things like this. So as men, we're supported and socialized to embody more of these traditionally masculine coded behaviors and to avoid the feminine coded behaviors. And that's where a lot of the mental health stuff lies, coming more in touch with your emotions, coming in touch with your body, developing emotional intelligence, and becoming better at relationship. So a lot of us as men learn to neglect and push away developing it in those domains. And as a result, we suffer on the mental health level often.
I see. Okay. And you said something very interesting. Excuse me. A term called toxic masculinity. Is there such thing as a toxic femininity then? And the reason I'm asking this is because it seems like, or at least I've read some research, is that we're pushing away more into the femininity strength and power, in which we should, right? But is it true that sometimes the pendulum swings so far on the other side that some women now feel burned out? Like, for example, it's too much on them, like the career, the family, the looks, like are we turning the pendulum too much on the other side? Am I making sense with my question, Mike?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things about that. One thing is this same pattern of more highly valuing masculine traits over feminine traits doesn't just impact men. Women also have this. There's, push to strive and work harder and make more money and achieve more and, meet the societal version of success. Everybody is experiencing some of the impacts of that. Our world is so busy and loud compared to what our ancestors experienced and where our nervous systems developed. So, there's impacts in all of that. And then I would say 100% there's toxic femininity. And, if you think about toxicity, like anything can be medicine or it can be toxic, but it depends the dose. If you take your entire bottle of vitamins in one sitting, it's going to have some negative impacts on you. But if you take your one pill a day, it can be really good and supportive. So I think a lot of it is context and dose, and is it in right relationship with the other aspects of your life?
I love how you put it together. So we can say that, and I think I totally agree with that, is that toxic masculinity can actually contage or affect women too. Like they can, that strive and want to be better career wise and money wise. It could actually be the masculine part expressing into the beautiful female energy field.
Yeah, that can be for sure. And, I think the level where it gets toxic is when there's some level of dominance or oppression, or using masculine power to harm the feminine compared to uphold and support it. Because, the beautiful, healthy masculine is supporting the feminine to thrive. And the beautiful, healthy feminine is supporting the masculine to thrive.
Agree. You work with men. What are men? I mean, this is a general question, so we can go into more specific ones. But what are men mostly suffering about? People that come to see you, when it comes to their trauma or their problems. What is the one that's underlying, that's coming more often, surfacing?
One of the main themes I see is self-worth issues. I'd say that's the most common. A lot of things wrap into that self-worth, self-esteem. stuff. And most of it seems to be rooted in, family environments that were unsupportive. So that got internalized as, there actually wasn't enough something. Some needs were unmet in childhood. So that gets internalized as I'm not good enough. But it's actually there wasn't enough holding. And that extends to the culture. The culture that the family is held in is also not great at meeting certain needs. So the family system itself is a little unworthy in a way. It's not enough. So that just gets translated into the individual psychology.
Well, that's I can totally agree with that, and I hear that more and more often. I suffered from that too, from where I'm coming from. It was almost, I don't think it was even sugar coated, or it wasn't even. It was directly said, "You're not good enough." Like, or at least the message I got, like you don't have the grades like other guys have in your class, or you don't do as well at home, or whatever. It was directly like expressed from my parents, and as a child, I thought, well, that's normal. I need to strive to be better, but I little did I know it's creating trauma in you.
For sure. And, working with your lens of the talker in you, I get very curious about how that messaging that came from your parents impacted the tone and voice of your talker. Where did your talker learn to talk from?
Very well. My talker for years has been extremely critical with very harsh language and tone. But the big problem was that I never realized that talker wasn't me, or never until later in my life, right? I thought that this self-talk is what we all have, and it's normal, and it's who I am, that voice that I hear in my mind. And as you can imagine, that's extremely toxic, and it's not true. We are not the voice in our heads, right? It took me a while to realize this, but yeah, very critical, extremely self-punishing critical, if that makes sense.
Totally. And it sounds like your parents might have been a little critical. Oh, you're not getting enough grades, Alex. You're not good enough.
That's what pushed me to do what I'm doing now, to bring awareness, because I said I didn't know that was what I was experiencing. I focused on the external factors, meaning the feelings I had, the pain, the discomfort. This is what my mind went to, but it wasn't connecting the voice with how I felt, with the emotions, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
And
so,
what's good? Where are you at now with it?
it's been quite some time now, but I think somebody gave me a couple of books on mindfulness about 8 or 9 years ago. And at the time, I looked through them, I read through them, and they talked about peace, meditation, self-reflection, the kind of how are you conversationing with yourself in your mind. It talked about all that, but first it went out through the window very quickly, right? It didn't stay with me. But of course, the message kept coming because this is what I needed. And the turning point was some health issues that I had. And because when you have this kind of voice constantly within you, it creates not only negative emotions and feelings, but also dis-ease. And eventually it will catch up to you. And so that's what really woke me up. So now I can say that the majority of during my day, extremely conscious, very present. I sleep like most of us, especially living in today's world. But I know right away when I sleep, which is a big difference. Before I wouldn't know, if that makes sense. I know exactly when I'm not present.
Good.
Yeah, that's why I am. And this podcast that I'm doing really is about bringing such awareness to other people that are in my shoes, where I was 10 years ago, when I had no idea what's happening to me. I was trying to fight my symptoms, not really looking into the cause. What is causing how I felt and my diseases, as we call them. But you also mentioned that you work with men about sexuality. Now, this is an interesting topic, because when we talk about sexuality, what comes to my mind, at least when talking to men, is we talk about maybe our partners, and maybe sometimes we touch on some sexual topics or sex topics, but they're not really, they're very surfaced, and they never really there's no rich context in them and meaning. But I'm assuming when you work with men about sexuality, it's a deeper work. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. So I have a lot of guys come to me around sexual issues, and it almost always leads to deeper relational trauma. It's a really good doorway. Sex is so compelling, so pleasurable, such a root human biological organism need that we're just so drawn to it. So a lot of people are finding that they're having some issue there. They want to grow, they want to get better or experience more connection through that. But it almost always opens the door to a whole bunch of other things that are actually deeper and more important to look at. But it's just a really compelling drive for a lot of men to look deeper into that space. And for me, there's also a piece where we kind of got this idea of like us as a human. There's a way that life force moves through us. It comes from some other place. We're all just made up of matter and water and the impacts from sunlight and the influence of our culture and ancestors. We're kind of a channel where these bigger energies combine and integrate. And there's the drive and biological push to reproduce is so deep within us, and that happens through sexuality. So we're in the space between the past and the future, and the way to get there is through sexuality, if we're looking at it from a biological perspective. So it's a domain of life where it's highly charged. There's a lot of energy in it. Like, a lot of us feel the most amount of pleasure that we feel anywhere in our life through sexual connection. We feel the most amount of emotional intimacy through sexual connection. There's the most amount of physical intimacy. So it's a place where you can really see where the energy is flowing or not flowing, or where the blocks and stuck places are in life, because there's so much charge around the topic. So, if there's a little kink in the place where the life force is moving through us, then we'll notice it in sexuality. So it's a really good starting place.
That's a good perspective. So for men out there that are listening to this and whether they have concerns or maybe they have some worries about their sexual life, what would you recommend? I mean, yes, talking to a specialist like you, I do recommend it. But is there anything on their own they can start as a first?
Yeah. So, a more connective self-pleasure practice can be really impactful. So instead of just turning on Pornhub and trying to get off as fast as possible, see what it's like to be with pleasure in your body as you masturbate without porn, without this external stimulation, and like really slowing down and listening to what really feels good for you and what brings you more alive, instead of just gearing right towards getting off an orgasm, being more present with the whole experience of sexual energy moving through your body.
What a beautiful answer. And I suppose that goes for many things in life, but be present, explore, learn about yourself. And it's probably true for women and men. I mean, you did that self-exploratory exercise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, there's less pressure. We don't have all these relational pressures of what it's like to be in the relational dynamic with a partner or a lover. So there's a lot more, there's a lot that can be discovered and explored in that space when that pressure is off, and you can just be with your own authentic self and body.
That's right. I find, I mean, just kind of putting my thoughts together around that, and let's see if you agree and give you context on this. Why is there so much shame, guilt, maybe even vulnerability when it comes to sex and sexual activity in general? What has caused this?
Well, that's a big question. So, what comes to mind is a few first things. I was just saying how it's sort of the domain in life where it's the most compelling, and, there's so much energy because there's a lot riding on it. A species doesn't exist if it doesn't reproduce. It needs sex to reproduce. So it's very powerful. It's where, our core creative capacity as humans starts. When things have that much power, things can go badly. So some sense of control and containment around sexuality is important, right? A lot of people develop sex addiction or porn addiction because of how much charge it has. And historically, there's a lot of impacts. If before birth control, if you were just having sex with whoever you wanted, whenever you wanted, or raping people or having sexual misconduct, there's a lot of impact in culture and society. So a lot of institutions were built up around how to contain the sexual energy in a good way. If there's not enough food for the tribe and you're more people are getting pregnant and people are going to starve because of it, like that's a massive issue. So there's a cultural containment that needs to happen. And that influenced religion, and then all this religious perspective on shame. And there's a strong sense of what right conduct is around sexuality from Christianity. So a lot of the Christian influence in the West has influenced how we're supposed to act with sexuality, which is not always in line with what feels authentic or might actually be good in the present current context. So that internalizes often a shame when there's this authentic desire to do something and there's a cultural conditioning that says don't do that, and we start to develop shame around that thing.
Yes. Some of those are strong, like not only you're wrong, you go to hell. I mean, those are some strong, like, I mean, you can see how you can fall into that if you follow those right religious dogmas and however you are brought up. It made me think about, because I've talked to other specialists and they're talking about how getting pregnant, people who are working with couples, getting pregnant and even keeping babies is very challenging nowadays, especially in the Western world.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that sexually, is that a reflection of our sexual of problems in sexuality, of this great area of energy that you're saying? Maybe is that showing us, hey, we're not living properly because this world of sexuality is suffering, and here's the result: many people can't get pregnant. Is there a connection between how dysfunctional maybe we live nowadays?
I think so. So are you saying like is that people are having difficulty getting pregnant or being pregnant?
I think mostly getting pregnant, but also being pregnant, both. But getting pregnant is the one that's coming up often in my conversation with counselors for couples.
Yeah. Well, there's been a massive decrease in sperm mobility, and blanking on the word right now, but the sperm quality has been going down a lot over time. And I think there's a lot of factors. So there's a lot of environmental impacts from medications getting into water supplies and all the phytoestrogens in our food and things that are getting into our bodies from the current agricultural system that it is having impacts, and pharmaceuticals. Also, stress has an impact. So there's a bit of the cultural context going on. There's an interesting frame that I like to play with sometimes, but there's a theory called Gaian theory. So it's basically that the whole planet itself, the ecosphere, is its own sort of self-organizing organism. So it's got its own consciousness, the entire planet and all the organisms on it together. And if we look at this frame I was sharing before of we're in the Anthropocene, humans are making imbalanced impact on the ecosphere. So there might be some ripple coming down from the larger self-organizing system that is Gaia, is the whole Earth, that is leading to the impacts of less human fertility. And
you're giving me a big answer here, and I like, because often humans, we're looking at one thing and we're trying to see, why is this wrong? Why is this cup wrong? And we can't see the big picture, like you're saying, that we're part of a larger organism and we're trying to zero in on one thing without giving it the connection as part of the entire organism. I mean, is that right? And it's difficult to answer a question when you're not seeing the big picture.
Totally. Yeah. And it's our nature to not see the big picture often. Organisms are very selfish. We're wired to reproduce ourselves and sustain ourselves and the people we care about, because if we don't have the people we care about, then we die. So our natural innate drive is to be quite egocentric.
Yes.
But these ecocentric perspectives, where we can actually zoom out and see the larger picture, can give us a lot of context of how to function in our individual nature.
Correct.
And the reality is we are part of something bigger.
Yes.
In a very biological way.
100%. No matter what you believe in, I think this is be very naive if we think that we're not part of a bigger picture, right?
Yeah.
Beautiful. I want to shift then to talk particularly about the inner talk that we all carry. But before we did this, I'm curious, and I want to ask you, the image that's behind you suggests a beautiful structure. Can you tell us a bit about what is that that room or that structure that you are in right now. And I know it's in beautiful Nelson, BC. For those of you who don't know, look up Nelson. It's absolutely a gorgeous. It's a tiny place, but it's one of the most beautiful small towns that I've ever been to. I used to drive a motorcycle or ride a motorcycle, so I would go through Nelson quite a bit to the back roads. Oh my God, is it a beautiful place?
Well, thanks for orienting to that. I'm quite proud of this. I built this structure by hand the last couple of years, and it's a round home with clay walls and it's a big skylight you can see. Yeah, I live on 88 acres on the side of a mountain in the forest, so I feel very blessed and privileged to make my home here and be able to steward this land.
This is beautiful. This alone, we can do another podcast on just that. Building a home from clay in a natural way, probably one of the most natural ways, in the shape that you've built it, and there's a purpose for it. Can you tell us just a few things about it, like something that people can take away from your experience of building a home like that?
Oh, it's not easy. I didn't have many construction skills when I started this project, but one of the main learnings has been a lot about how the creative process goes and my own capacity, which all humans have. But there's so much capacity to learn, and we live in such a connected age. I could use YouTube and go from having zero skills to building a quite beautiful structure in this amount of time. Building it feels, I feel like it's been such a gift to be able to be in this creative process of building something useful and beautiful from the ground up. So many little steps and, thousands and thousands of little steps that I had to be present with the whole time while still orienting to the larger long-term goal of completing it. It's definitely changed me in the process.
Oh, it must have. And as I said, in the description, we'll place your website so people can connect with you directly and can ask you more questions about your practice and this, because I'm sure people will be curious. This is not every day you meet someone or hear about someone who's built a house from clay in Canada, particularly. So thanks for sharing this couple lines. So now I want to switch about and talk a little more in depth about the inner critic, the inner talker. Now, and I start always with this simple question. When I say the inner talker, the talker in you, what is the first thing that comes to mind, Michael?
The first thing that comes to mind, there's a model of how the brain functions from Dan Siegel. Have you seen this hand model? So, we have our brain stem, which is our reptilian brain, very old, ancient, just all about survival and safety.
Survival and fear, yes.
And reproduction. And then there's this limbic system, the more mammalian brain, that goes over top of that is more about connection. Our mammalian ancestors needed to be in tribes or groups in order to survive and exist. And then with this like prefrontal cortex that goes over top, this more human brain that can deal with complex thoughts and think about the future and the past, and this is where communication happens. So I think of how the talker exists in this part of the brain, but is built on these more ancient parts. And, it's sort of like a garden bed. The talker is sort of planted on top of this deeper evolutionary body and nervous system that it exists on.
Okay, this is a beautiful explanation. Nobody's gonna explain it that way. You went into the more physical or biological way of explaining it, which I really like. Men versus women. I know it's not difficult. It's not easy to generalize like that, but who has a more louder, stronger talker?
Oh, it's curious. I've never been in a woman's brain, so I can't experience. I can't say for sure. I just say they have different qualities. They have a different sort of voice or a different sort of orientation or purpose. And I would suggest that hormones also have a play in that.
They would, for sure.
I imagine testosterone-driven men have a bit more edgy directiveness to their inner talker, where a woman is more oriented around emotionality.
For sure.
Relationality.
You mentioned earlier self-worth is one of the challenges men come to you for. Can you also say that this is kind of the main inner talk that they have, self-worth or self-critical? Is that what you see as what the talker shows up for the people you work with, for the men you work with?
Yeah. How would I say? I think if we go back to this brain model, I think the self-worth issues go a little deeper. They're in these like pre-verbal parts of our brain. And then the talker takes that feeling or emotion and translates it into words and criticism that are expressing something that's going on deeper.
So in order to change that surface one, you kind of have to work with the deeper levels. Am I understanding you correct? Or
Yeah. And, I'm a somatic therapist, so I work often with this frame, that what's going on the surface almost always has deeper roots. So trying to track what's going on in the deeper roots that is manifesting the unpleasant thing on the surface. Like
the
you shared,
iceberg.
you manifested this disease, which, this external discomfort in your body or your world. But, you learn to turn inward and track more into the internal roots of it. So similar thing. I think if you keep following the talker deeper, you go more into the body and the nervous system.
I like it. And it is on my list to talk about the somatic therapy, which is what you practice. Can you tell us first with a line or two, what is somatic therapy for people who may not be familiar with it? And is it helpful to deal with this critical inner self-doubt and blame talker that we may carry?
Yeah, for sure. So somatic therapy is a body-based therapy. And, we can just leverage this model I just shared with you. But what's going on the surface of our mind and what we notice as thoughts and language in our head is rooted in the deeper emotions and the deeper drive for survival and reproduction. So somatic therapy, we don't just talk about stories and make plans and talk about your trauma as the primary thing. We learn how it's stored in your body and your nervous system and the patterns that are there around that. And then we're able to shift it from this deeper level. So, like we were just talking about my house, if the foundation's a little off, then the whole house is going to be a little wobbly. So with somatic therapy, we get more to the foundation of the mind and make shifts on that level so that the whole structure built on top of it can be in more integrity.
Beautiful. But why does the brain saves and keeps those traumatic or negative patterns or preserves this negative energy and repeats it? What's the purpose of that? It seems self-destructive. I mean, it's definitely not helping you flourish.
It's not helping you flourish now, but at one point it did. And I think it's important to notice that is we're not doing things, biology does things as efficient as it can. So when a trauma happened, maybe you're in your family environment and let's say your dad's super overworked and stressed and, he can't handle your bigness or loudness at the end of the day. So he's like, Alex, you need to be more quiet. Like,
I've heard that.
and so you internalize, you get this little relational trauma of like, oh, when I'm loud or I make noise or express myself, it's not safe. It's not safe because my dad's going to punish me. So you learn, and your inner talker will pick this up of like, hey, be quiet, don't talk. What you're saying is stupid. You're worthless when you express yourself and what that's doing is actually trying to keep you safe from being punished from your father. And that feels really bad. We're so driven as humans to make sure that we feel safe in our social environments because our ancestors who weren't safe and got banished died and didn't put on their genetics into the next generation. So anyway, what I'm pointing to here is that the trauma had a function at some point. In the war of childhood, often that trauma developed as a way to keep us safe. And it worked. So we just keep doing it. We're like, why change this pattern? It's been working my entire life. Why would I shift it? Even though it's completely maladaptive in your adult life, that old script and pattern is running. So without conscious awareness and attention to it to shift the pattern, then it will just keep going on for ages.
Wow, for those of you who are actually seeing me, see that my face just changes as Michael is going through it because I'm internalizing what he's saying, and it's so powerful. At some point, the things that are difficult for us now, it's stressful. And speaking about myself, it served the purpose. But it seems to be that there's a gap that the brain itself wouldn't know how to, like, it will keep repeating this even though it's not functional. So there's a gap there of actually understanding that, hey, this worked 10 years ago or 30 years ago, but in this environment right now, I don't need this pattern or behavior. So what you're saying is that unless consciousness comes into play a role here, it'll just keep going on those old patterns. the brain.
Exactly. Let me give you an analogy to paint the picture. So in World War II, a bunch of Japanese soldiers were interned on different islands throughout the Pacific. And some of them lost communications at some points, and the war ended. But some of these soldiers never learned that the war was actually over. So they were still in their duties and fulfilling their roles to protect the
Ready.
island. And the last one was found in the 70s. So, he's still fulfilling his mission, which he was given during the war, which was very appropriate. But the war's been over for 20 years. And, some of them, when they found them, they were very resistant. They thought spies were trying to convince them that, the war was over, but they believed it was still going. And, it took some convincing to get them back and out and into the current reality of, hey, we're in a post-war generation now. So I think it's the same thing with our psychology. We think the war is still happening, even though it's not. And there requires some intervention in order to help update those parts of our system that, hey, it's actually safe now. We don't need to still run on the same mission that we need to in our childhood. And what's also beautiful about that is, when they brought them back, they weren't like, hey, you're stupid. Like, the war's over. Like, why are you doing this? Like, what a waste of time. You wasted so much of your life. But they actually brought them back with gratitude and honor. Like, thank you for showing up for your mission so well and like being so devoted to your role here. And it is true the war's over and you did a good job. And let me give you a new role now. You've got so many skills from doing your mission before, but let's help update that to the current reality so that we can use your skills in the current context.
What a beautiful example. I've read about it. Thanks for bringing it up, Michael. And then there's other examples that they've showed with other wars, how that can impact and then carry on after the war is over, and some of the interventions that were done to change that. But when it comes to, again, me as an example, the cost might be too high for that intervention. What I'm trying to say is that I figured out that I have to intervene consciously with these patterns that you're describing, that the war is over, but my mind is still on war, right? When I had health issues that could have resulted fatally for me, like with my heart and other parts of my body. So up until then, I didn't know that this old behavior and patterns that saved me at some point, protected me from my father, let's say, it resulted into these illnesses until it almost was too late. Does that make sense? Like it could cost you a lot until you self-realize that consciousness wakes you up and say, wait a minute, this isn't working.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, there's a lot of factor complexity in there. Like, perhaps you said eventually you got given some books when the health problems got really bad. And, that was sort of what helped shift your awareness to looking at a different way to approach it. And, we can't exactly control when the awareness starts to wake up. We can put efforts in. Like, it's really good to read and learn. It's really good to go to therapy. It's really good to talk to wise people and elders that have experience around these things. And so there's lots of ways for wake up calls to come, but for a lot of us, we often push way past when we could have dealt with it, and some symptoms emerge, or some conflict in relationships, or some breakdown, or some sort of difficulty is often the wake up call.
I've read, and then he's not the only one, but Eckhart Tolle would say that it might be even a gift if you have the trauma and the loud talker, the self-critical, that creates so much stress, pain, and illnesses in oneself. Because when it is that loud, the likelihood of consciousness waking up is much bigger, because you can't tolerate it for too long. Something has to give.
Yeah, I love that perspective. I often think of trauma as a gift. We can look at it as something that has a lot of problems and pain and discomfort with it. But we can also look at it like something, number one, that protected us, but number two, something that's teaching us and guiding us to connect more with our gifts. Trauma is often a pathway to our gifts, and we often get traumatized in the places that we're more sensitive. But I can see in your case, it's like, it seems like there's something around the talker and the emergence of that in you that like had a lot of discomfort, led to disease, led you to go inward and come into mindfulness and mental health. And now you're having a podcast where you're sharing information and gifts and helping others to, not have such an uncomfortable experience as you did. So in a lot of ways, your trauma around that was really beautiful. Like it brought you to sharing your gifts more with the world.
Absolutely, I agree. If I said the statement, I am my talker, and by talker I mean the inner voice and the conversations that we have, and a sentence, I am not my talker, which one is more correct and why not?
I'm taking a bit of a moment to respond there because
Please.
I would say the statement "I am my talker" is incorrect because we're that, yes, but we're also so much more. And when I say I'm not my talker, we can point to that so much more, and that talker is part of us. It's part of our inner ecosystem. And personally, I have hesitancy to deny any parts. Like if the talker's there, I want to welcome it and learn what it has to offer and what its gifts are, and not just exile it, but get it in right relationship with the rest of the system. So I think both are true. I'm not my talker is probably a little bit more true, but the bigger truth is like I'm my talker and so much more.
I love it. What a beautiful answer. Pardon me. What a beautiful answer, because it also depends who is asking and how this question is asked. This is my perspective on it. From a point of view of total awareness that I believe we all are, you're not the talker because the talker happens in you. From that perspective, you're much bigger because the talker happens with. In other words, the talker wouldn't exist without you, the being you. But then, as a human being playing on this earth, the talker is part of your inner system. If I understand you correctly, Michael, right? So that
Exactly.
curiosity of how does it fit? What is it here to teach me? And what can I learn? It's a great, and thank you for that's an amazing philosophy. I like it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And I
I
think
want
what you're saying there about that conscious you, to be able to connect with that
Yeah.
bigger part of yourself, who has a capacity to get outside of identifying with the talker and observe it. It feels like the most important step there. Connecting with this bigger sense of self, who can hold the other parts.
Exactly. It's beautiful. When I'm completely present, when it happens to be that, I feel so wide and big, and not from an ego perspective, like not bigger than you, but in totality with you. The talker almost feels like, the way I can express it is, first of all, it almost disappears, if not at all, but it feels like it's bowing down in the process of disappearing. It's like, I see the big guy's here, I'm going to step away. If that makes sense. I don't know. It might sound too out there, this kind of definition, but that's how it feels. There isn't a talker. The talker kind of, right?
Yeah, totally.
So it's a beautiful experience. And it begs me, I need to ask, since we're talking about this kind of a bit of a higher lens on that, when you talk about, on your website, it talks about you being not a monk. You help me understand this. You spend times with monks and you were given, I don't know if it's a title. Is it a title, or like you've been named a monk, or?
I was ordained as a Buddhist monk for a short period of time. I spent a lot of time in a Theravadan Buddhist practice in my 20s. I still practice daily, but it's not as core in my life. I'm not meditating 6 to 12 hours a day. We're down to 1 or so.
Tell us about that experience. I mean, people have either heard about it, seen it even on movies or wherever on the social media. It seems like a fascinating life, being a monk, but of course, it isn't for everybody. Can you tell us about that experience? And most particularly, do monks have talkers? This is what I want to.
Yeah, it was a really rich, beautiful, challenging experience. And I think monks are probably more intimate with their talkers than the average person because they spend so much time in their mind. You get to understand the nuance of the talker a lot. Yeah, and what you're sort of sharing about this sort of zooming out and coming into this broader awareness, a lot of the practice is about that. It's like, how do we inhabit more with this conscious awareness, observing all these different voices in our heads, and the patterning there instead of identifying with it, and just really landing that more and more in our nervous system and our embodied awareness is how do we spend more and more time in that bigger, broader awareness. But that's not an easy thing. It's very, very difficult. But meditation for me is sort of one of the main practices too.
Well, it appears to me that kind of the goal of a monk is to achieve this complete presence, which also means unidentified with the mind. Because if the talker is talking, you're not present, because it's either projecting or it's talking about the past, which kind of denies presence by default. So it seems to me that the goal almost is to achieve a life without talker as much as possible.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. It seems like a true frame. I really like how you pointed like the talker there lives in the present or in the future or the past, and something else emerges in the present. Yeah, I feel like this really great, succinct way to point out the way the talker functions.
No, the talker does not like presence because it obviously it's poison in a way, if I can say it this way. And I don't mean to use a negative word, but that's what it is. The presence is where the talker doesn't live. What pushed you to become or to, I mean, you went through a journey to become an ordained monk. So what was that, the reasoning behind it?
I just love the practice. It's where I felt the most love and connection, and it just really aligned with my values at the time. I did discover through that process, I was raised in the West, in the suburbs in Calgary, and, my dad was in business, and, I was surrounded by people and, the Western sort of way of relating around romance and sexuality. So during that life of being a monk, I sort of denied all that. And there's a little bit of a running away of like, I don't like all this that I came from. I mean, I'm going to try something else. And it had a lot of beauty in it, and there was a lot of growth. But at some point, I discovered, like this is the context I'm from, and I might be of more value if I'm more engaged in the Western world in which I came, and bring some of those gifts I got from that time back to this reality.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Where was that, if you don't mind me asking, this experience, and for how long did you stay there?
I was mostly in India, and there was a number of bouts, but the longest time was 3 months.
Okay. Wow. Okay. I need to ask you this question. Let's see if I can formulate it right. So you're in a temple, and it's all monks around you. Have you seen a situation where they'll start either bumping into each other or arguing about silly things like we would nowadays here in the Western world, where the egos or the talker is kind of attacking the other person? Oh, you took that away from me, or you cut me off on the highway, or this everyday thing where the talker is attacking the person next to you. Have you seen that the monks fall for that?
Personally, no. I'm sure it happens in some places. Just because you're a monk or a priest or some sort of like spiritual role doesn't mean that you're that developed emotionally or relationally. As we've seen so much sexual misconduct among spiritual leaders.
True. Sadly, but true.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't think spiritual practice alone gets you to develop to the level of being great with relationships and emotions.
Hey, the talker is very persistent. Like the talker, like what I'm hearing from Michael is, and I agree with you. Even monks or whatever spiritual leaders they are, they can fall for that because the talker is relentless, and any gap it has, it will find to yap about you or other people, right? To create some drama.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, totally. And I think there's something too is like if you do spend a lot of time in presence, if the talker does get away and get control of the microphone, it can really wreak some havoc. If it's being outside your awareness and taking charge with a consciousness, it can create even more problems. So.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It seems like there's something that I call the talker crowd mentality. Like I don't know if it's connecting with what you're saying, but it grows much bigger when it's 2, 3, 4, 5, or 100 of you with the same unconscious beliefs and drives.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That's a great frame. Very true. Yeah. I mean, we're such tribal beings, we were talking a little bit about the limbic system before, which, is so believes we need to be in connection with others to survive. And, that's rooted in biological fact. And, when the talker gets in with that and we're in this more tribalized mentality, like it can just run. And we see a lot of that. Like U.S. politics, you see a lot of this tribalization and some very strong beliefs that may be very problematic coming from whole groups of people because they're empowered and entitled to do it because of that tribal mindset.
No, absolutely. I mean, you see it not in politics 100% right now in the US, but also during COVID, for example, or during a game where you see like professionals or people respected in the community act like, I mean, I don't want to use the word animal, but that's what comes to my mind, right? Like, well, like you explained, they're not acting from a conscious part of their brain. Like, I mean, otherwise, how would you do it, right?
Yeah,
Right,
totally.
100%. Can I ask you, you work with the body, right? I mean, we've talked about your practice, it's focusing on the body, but the talker is inner, like it doesn't seem to be physical. How do you help your clients recognize the talker as not just mental, but also physical? Because obviously it has a physical impact on the body.
Yeah. I think we work with this vision of like a garden. Like I feel like the talker is seated in the soil of the nervous system, the biology. So, if you see that your tomato plants are, not thriving, they're too small or they have some malnutrition, if you just focus on the tomato, why don't you grow better or become bigger or, just try to have a conversation with it. Nothing's going to change. You need to look at the soil that it's growing in. So, you look at the tomato plant and then you look at the soil and, that soil is more what's going on in the sensory motor system of our body and brain. So you can always track it. We can start with the thought, but there's almost always a sensation or emotion or image that comes with the thoughts that the talker is saying, and that's a way to land and understand where it's rooted in the soil, and then we can work with that on that level.
Wow, what a beautiful analogy. I really, really like it. Now, many people, I mean, okay, let's talk about silencing or trying to resist the talker from a somatic perspective. What happens in the body when we resist or even regress the talker instead of noticing it and working to either hear it or create that better relationship?
Yeah, well, I think it depends how we silence it. Some things might work. If you choose to do some breath work or meditation or go for a run or play some music or have a conversation, it might get quiet for a time and you're doing something that's, generative and resourcing. So, that can be like a really healthy way to silence it by focusing on something else. So it doesn't need to be so loud. Then there's all sorts of maladaptive ways of trying to silence it. Smoking, drinking, drugs, addiction, porn, social media can be ways to distract it. But I think the value of the more generative ones is like you can actually engage with it and see what it's trying to point to. Like what's the unmet need that the talker is emerging from? Like what in the nervous system is saying I'm not safe, that is making the talker start to complain or criticize or blame. And if we can presence what it's pointing to and understand how we can meet that need, it won't need to exist. It won't need to be so loud anymore.
Well, why is it not that bastard? And I'm using that word because sometimes it feels that way. Why is it not telling us direct what it wants? Why is it, like you said, there's always a reason we need it? And I totally agree with you. It's not direct to tell you, hey, this went wrong 17 years ago and it's not fulfilled, or, it's not, there's no closure, or I still need this. But it's instead coming up with a variety of other conversations and that you cannot connect back to that.
Yeah. Well, one thing is you're probably not listening enough. I think of it, a child like a toddler, which might be some of the psychological maturity of where this talker is rooted in. It doesn't know actually what it needs, and it's your like wiser, more adult, zoomed out, broader perspective of self, that consciousness we're talking about, who can look at this complaining and this bitching and this criticizing and listen for what's it's actually trying to get. Like a kid might be drawing on the walls and banging and screaming and getting in fights with his siblings, but what it really needs is some attention and connection and maybe a hug and some regulation from its parent. So part of why it can't tell us what it needs is it doesn't know. We need to help it understand what it needs. We're the parent. The talker is a much more immature part of our self.
If we can drop the talker completely what would the world look like? All humans, like, hypothetically speaking.
I don't know if that's totally possible, but let's be hypothetical with it. Yeah, just a sense of more presence and connection, creativity. Yeah, I imagine the world might be very beautiful if people were not functioning from their talker primarily.
I agree with you. I think so. What there's so much to talk with Michael about because his journey has been so rich. What really moves men, Michael, when it comes to mental health work or therapy work, or even whether it's in sexuality or any part of their life? What moves us? What makes it work for us?
Yeah, well, somewhat unfortunately, but it seems to be the pattern. There's usually some sort of crisis. That's the initiation. You know, there's a breakup, they got conflict with their partner, they're having some sort of issue around their performance at work or with their friends or in bed. And it's usually the pain that starts to motivate a lot of men. And I don't think that pattern continues, but often people sort of have to hit rock bottom or their version of rock bottom before they start to change. When things are working and we feel good, there's not a lot of impetus to shift. But over time, we get more sensitive of when things are out of integrity or out of alignment. And we develop more sensitivity to the signs coming from us that something can change or needs to change earlier on, like the more we do our development work. But often the first thing, there's some sort of initiating crisis that happens.
I totally agree. And of course, the talk is, generally speaking, is extremely louder when there is crisis. Or at least I can speak from my experience and people I've worked with. When something is going wrong, it will remind you, it will repeat it to you, and then when it exaggerated often of how it went wrong, and look at you. Of course, it's going to happen to you, right? It's not, the talk is not helpful in those moments at all.
Yeah, totally.
So what can we say if somebody's going through a crisis like that, or whether it's larger or smaller storm, and the talker is criticizing like that constantly? What is the simple practice or first step they can take that you recommend that they'll calm the body and the mind? Before they see a specialist, what they can do right away?
Yeah, well, I mean, it really depends on context. Some people, it's actually very uncomfortable to be in their body if they're having some sort of, um, physical crisis, for instance, or if they're having a relational crisis, it's very difficult to be in relationship. But it's to orient to where can you find safety? If you're a lot of pain in your body, can you be with people you love? Can you, shift your environment so that you can be more comfortable with it? Um, I just spent time with my dying father a lot this year, and a lot of pain. But the best thing we could do for him was create a lot of comfort. That allowed the voices in his head to quiet down. Whereas if there's a lot of relational suffering and tension and conflict, orienting more to how can I be in my body in a pleasurable way, in a safe way. And maybe I go hiking for a couple of days in the mountains by myself and only have positive experiences surrounded by beauty and nature. So the main thing is to orient to where can you find safety.
That's a beautiful answer. Well, before I ask my last question, I want to say, for those of you listening and that would have could have an opportunity to speak to Michael, please connect with him. I'll put his contact information in the description, because what a authentic and genuine conversation I've had, and then this genuine energy that you emit, that Michael. It's been wonderful. And for people who might be looking for help, especially men, I think they'll be blessed to work with you.
Thanks so much, Alex.
You're welcome. And then my landing question is: if your talker was a real human standing in front of you now, what would you tell him?
It should be something like, "Come here." I kind of feel him there, just in front of me. Living a little in the future, and just tapping into that broader consciousness, sense of presence, and just welcoming it here, feeling how it's safe to just exist in this present moment.
Bring him to safety in here and now.
Yeah, come here, buddy. I got you.
I love that. Come here, buddy. Do you have a name for your talk? Some people name it. I mean, they don't. I'm just curious.
The way I relate to my talker is, it's actually like I'm trying to think of an example, but the Power Rangers, they would all have their own thing, and then they had to fight the boss, and then get together and make like this big robot out of 5 of them. I feel like my talker's like that. It's actually a whole bunch of little talkers that get together to form some big super talker. So often I try to orient to, what specific piece am I talking to right now, and I often give those ones names.
Yeah. For the moment you're working with it.
Yeah, I see which part of my talker is the loudest, and I'll relate to that one specifically.
Oh, okay. What a great way. Because I mean, I realized that most of us would have different I guess part of the talker, and create that super talker as you put it together, because sometimes it can be negative, sometimes it feels like it's pushing you, sometimes it can be in guilt or whatever the tone might be. It feels like there's 17 different talkers, but they're part of that super talker. So you are kind of naming the one that's the loudest, like that's you, right?
Yeah,
the
what was
moment.
with the control stick driving the super talker at the moment?
That's a good way to do it. But what a wonderful conversation. Before we end it, is there anything? I mean, we kind of went with different angles, and we explored different kind of parts of this conversation. Is there anything that we missed that you'd like to leave the listeners and viewers with?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the thrust of what I invite people towards it is what you were talking about. Like, how do you just come back to the present and feel the safety that's here? And that's actually where the best future emerges from often. That's where those moments of, insight and clarity can just sort of appear. So just inviting people to, come back into their body and themselves and realize the context we're in. We live in such abundant, amazing times where there's so much support, there's so much resource, there's so much capacity to get our needs met, and we're just so blessed. Like, I feel a lot of gratitude for living it in these times. And there's a lot of challenges, and the more we can orient to the good, the more capacity we have to deal with the challenges.
Beautiful. How beautiful said. I don't know. I don't think I can add anything to it besides saying yes, the presence is always sweeter. Like I like to say, better and sweeter than what your talker will make it look like. Even in times of challenges, some horrific times, the only real action will arise from the presence. Like whatever you need to do, whatever is possible to do, it can only be visible from here and now. The talker probably won't be able to do it for you. Thank you, Michael. This was a wonderful conversation. It's an absolute honor. And I know we could have covered like a 1,000 more questions with you because of everything you bring to the table. I'm really looking forward to part 2 down the road in another season of Mind Triumph to have you again. But again, it's been an absolute pleasure having you. It's been an honor, Michael. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Alex. That's great.
Thank you for listening to Mind Triumph. Share it or leave me a note. Remember, your talker isn't you, presence is. Less talker, more presence. See you next time.